Chapter 11. Tarzan of the Apes was led directly from the royal dome to the quarries of Veltopus, which lie 1/4 of a mile from the nearer of the 8 domes which constitute the city. A 9th dome was in course of construction, and it was toward this that the line of burdened slaves wound from the entrance to the quarry to which the ape-man was conducted. Just below the surface, in a well-lighted chamber, he was turned over to the officer in charge of the quarry guard, to whom the king's instructions concerning him were communicated. "Your name," demanded the officer, opening a large book that lay upon the table at which he was seated. "He is as dumb as the Zertalikhalals," explained the commander of the escort that had brought him to the quarry. "Therefore he has no name." "We will call him the Giant," then said the officer, "for as such has he been known since his capture, and he wrote in his book Zoanthrol, with Zoanthrogo as the owner, and Trohanadalmakas as the city of his origin." And then he turned to one of the warriors lolling upon a nearby bench. "Take him to the timbering crew in the extension of Tunnel 13 at the 36th level, and tell the Vental in charge to give him light work and see that no harm befalls him, for such are the commands of the Thagostogo. But wait, here is his number. Fasten it upon his shoulder." The warrior took the circular piece of fabric with black hieroglyphics stamped upon it and affixed it with a metal clasp to the left shoulder of Tarzan's green tunic, and then, motioning the ape-man to precede him, quit the chamber. Tarzan now found himself in a short, dark corridor which presently opened into a wider and lighter one, along which innumerable, unladen slaves were moving in the same direction that his guard now escorted him. He noticed that the floor of the corridor had a constant downward gradient, and that it turned ever to the right, forming a great spiral leading downward into the earth. The walls and ceiling were timbered, and the floor paved with flat stones, worn smooth by the millions of sandaled feet that had passed over them. At sufficiently frequent intervals, candles were set in niches in the left-hand wall, and also at regular intervals other corridors opened out of it. Over each of these openings were more of the strange hieroglyphics of Menuni. As Tarzan was to learn later, these designated the levels at which the tunnels lay and led to circular corridors which surrounded the main spiral runway. From these circular corridors ran the numerous horizontal tunnels leading to the workings at each level. Shafts for ventilation and emergency exit pierced these tunnels at varying distances, running from the surface to the lowest levels of the quarry. At almost every level, a few slaves turned off into these lateral tunnels, which were well lighted, though not quite as brilliantly as the spiral. Shortly after they had commenced the descent, Tarzan, accustomed from infancy to keen observation, had taken note of the numbers of tunnel entrances they passed, but he could only conjecture at the difference in the depths of the levels into which they opened. A rough guess placed them at 15 feet, but before they reached the 36th, into which they turned, Tarzan felt that there must be an error in his calculations. For he was sure that they could not be 540 feet below the earth's surface with open flames and no forced ventilation. The horizontal corridor they now entered after leaving the spiral curved sharply to the right and then back to the left. Shortly afterward it crossed a wide, circular corridor in which were both laden and unladen slaves, beyond which were 2 lines, those laden with rock moving back in the direction from which Tarzan had come, while others, bearing lumber, moved in the same direction that he did. With both lines there were unladen slaves. After traversing the horizontal tunnel for a considerable distance, they came at last upon the working party, and here Tarzan was turned over to the Vental, a warrior who, in the military organizations of the Menunians, commands 10 men. "So this is the Giant," exclaimed the Vental, "and we are not to work him too hard." His tone was sneering and disagreeable. "Such a giant," he cried. "Why, he is no larger than I, and they are afraid to let him do any work into the bargain. Mark you, he will work here or get the lash. Kalfastoban permits no sluggards," and the fellow struck his chest vauntingly. He who had brought Tarzan appeared disgusted. "You will do well, Kalfastoban," he said, as he turned away to retrace his steps to the guard-room, "to heed the king's commands. I should hate to be wearing your harness if aught befell this speechless slave that has set every tongue in Veltopus going and made Elkamol Hago so jealous of Zoanthrogo that he would slip steel between his ribs were it not that he could then no longer steal." The great wizard's applause. "Kalfastoban fears no king," blustered the Vental, "least of all the sorry specimen that befouls the throne of Veltopishago. He fools no one but himself. We all know that Zoanthrogo is his brain and Gefasto his sword." However, warned the other, "Be careful of Zoanthrol," and he departed. Kalfastoban Vental set the new slave to work upon the timbering of the tunnel as it was excavated from the great moraine that formed the quarry, The line of slaves coming from the surface empty-handed passed down one side of the tunnel to the end, loosened each a rock, or if heavy a rock to two men, and turned back up the tunnel's opposite side, carrying their burdens back to the spiral runway used by those leaving the workings and so up and out to the new dome. The earth, a light clay, that filled the interstices between the rocks and the moraine was tamped into the opening behind the wall timbers, the tunnel being purposely made sufficiently large to permit of this. Certain slaves were detailed for this work. Others carried timbers cut to the right dimensions down to the timbering crew, of which Tarzan was one. It was only necessary for this crew of 3 to scoop a narrow, shallow trench in which to place the foot of each wallboard, set them in place and slip the ceiling board on top of them. At each end of the ceiling boards was a cleat previously attached at the surface which kept the wallboards from falling in after being set in place. The dirt tamped behind them fastened them solidly in their places, the whole making a quickly erected and substantial shoring. The work was light for the ape-man, though he still was weak from the effects of his wounds, and he had opportunities constantly to observe all that went on around him and to gather new information relative to the people in whose power he found himself. Kalfastaban he soon set down as a loud-mouthed braggart, from whom one need have nothing to fear during the routine of their everyday work, but who would bear watching if ever opportunity came for him to make a show of authority or physical prowess before the eyes of his superiors. The slaves about him worked steadily but seemed not to be overtaxed, while the guards, which accompanied them constantly, in the ratio of about 1 warrior to every 50 slaves, gave no indications of brutality in the treatment they accorded their charges, insofar as Tarzan was able to observe. The fact that puzzled him most now, as it had since the moment of his first return to consciousness, was the stature of these people. They were no pygmies, but men fully as large as the usual run of Europeans. There was none quite as tall as the ape-man, but there were many who missed it by but the scantiest fraction of an inch. He knew that they were Veltopus Macusians, the same people he had seen battling with the Trohanadal Macusians. They spoke of having captured him in the battle that he had seen waged, and they called him Zoanthrol, the giant, yet they were as large as he. And as he had passed from the royal dome to the quarry, he had seen their gigantic dome dwellings rising fully 400 feet above his head. It was all preposterous and impossible, yet he had the testimony of all his faculties that it was true. Contemplation of it but tended to confuse him more, and so he gave over all attempts to solve the mystery and set himself to the gathering of information concerning his captors and his prison against that time which he well knew must some day come, when the means of escape should offer itself to the alert and cunning instincts of the wild beast that, at heart, he always considered himself. Wherever he had been in Veltopus Marcus, whoever he had heard refer to the subject, he had had it borne in upon him that the people were generally dissatisfied with their king and his government. And he knew that among a discontented people efficiency would be at low ebb and discipline demoralized to such an extent that, should he watch carefully, he must eventually discover the opportunity he sought, through the laxity of those responsible for his safekeeping. He did not expect it today or tomorrow, but today and tomorrow were the days upon which to lay the foundation of observation that would eventually reveal an avenue of escape. When the long working day at last drew to a close, the slaves were conducted to their quarters, which, as Tarzan discovered, were always on levels near to those in which they labored. He, with several other slaves, was conducted to the 35th level and into a tunnel the far end of which had been widened to the proportions of a large chamber. The narrow entrance to which had been walled up with stone, except for a small aperture through which the slaves were forced to pass in and out of their chamber upon all fours, and when the last of them was within, this was closed and secured by a heavy door outside which 2 warriors watched throughout the night. Once inside and standing upon his feet, the ape-man looked about him to discover himself within a chamber so large that it seemed easy to accommodate the great throng of slaves that must have numbered fully 5,000 souls of both sexes. The women were preparing food over small fires, the smoke of which found its way from the chamber through openings in the ceiling. For the great number of fires, the amount of smoke was noticeably little, a fact which was, however, accounted for by the nature of the fuel, a clean, hard charcoal, but why the liberated gases did not asphyxiate them all was quite beyond the ape-man, as was still the riddle of the open flames and the pure air at the depth where the workings lay. Candles burned in niches all about the walls, and there were at least 6 large ones standing upon the floor. The slaves were of all ages from infancy to middle age, but there were no aged venerables among them. The skins of the women and children were the whitest Tarzan had ever seen, and he marveled at them until he came to know that some of the former and all of the latter had never seen daylight since birth. The children who were born here would go up into the daylight sometime, when they were of an age that warranted beginning the training for the vocations their masters had chosen for them, but the women who had been captured from other cities would remain here until death claimed them. Unless that rarest of miracles occurred, they should be chosen by a Veltopis Macusian warrior as his mate, but that was scarce even a remote possibility. Since the warriors almost invariably chose their mates from the slaves of the white tunic with whom they came in daily contact in the domes above ground. The faces of the women bore the imprint of a sadness that brought a spontaneous surge of sympathy to the breast of the savage ape-man. Never in his life had he seen such abject hopelessness depicted upon any face. As he crossed the room, many were the glances that were cast upon him, for it was obvious from his deep tan that he was a newcomer, and too there was that about him that marked him of different clay from them, and soon there were whispers running through the throng. For the slaves who had entered with him had passed the word of his identity to the others, and who, even in the bowels of the earth, had not heard of the wondrous giant captured by Zoanthrogo during the battle with the Trohanadal Macusians. Presently a young girl, kneeling above a brazier over which she was grilling a cut of flesh, caught his eye and motioned him to her. As he came he saw that she was very beautiful, with a pale, translucent skin, the whiteness of which was accentuated by the blue-black of a wealth of lustrous hair. "You are the giant?" she asked. "I am Zoanthrol," he replied. "He has told me about you," said the girl. "I will cook for you too. I cook for him." "Unless," she added with a trace of embarrassment, "there is another you would rather have cook for you." "There is no one I would rather have cook for me," Tarzan told her. "But who are you and who is he?" "I am Talaska," she replied, "but I know him only by his number. He says that while he remains a slave he has no name, but will go always by his number, which is 800 cubed plus 19. I see that you are 800 cubed plus 21. She was looking at the hieroglyphics that had been fastened upon his shoulder. "Have you a name?" "They call me Zoanthrol." "Ah," she said, "you are a large man, but I should scarcely call you a giant. He too is from Trohanadal Muckus, and he is about your height. I never heard that there were any giants in Minuni except the people they call Zertalakalos." "I thought you were a Zertalakalo," said a man's voice at Tarzan's ear. The ape-man turned to see one of the slaves with whom he had been working, eyeing him quizzically, and smiled. "I am a Zertalakalo to my masters," he replied. The other raised his brows. "I see," he said. "Perhaps you are wise. I shall not be the one to betray you," and passed on about his business. "What did he mean?" asked the girl. "I have never spoken until now, since they took me prisoner," he explained, "and they think I am speechless, though I am sure that I do not look like a Zertalakolol, yet some of them insist that I am one." "I have never seen one," said the girl. "You are fortunate," Tarzan told her. "They are neither pleasant to see nor to meet." "But I should like to see them," she insisted. "I should like to see anything that was different from these slaves whom I see all day and every day." "Do not lose hope," he encouraged her, "for who knows but that it may be very soon that you will return to the surface." "Return," she repeated. "I have never been there." "Never been to the surface, you mean since you were captured?" "I was born in this chamber," she told him, "and never have I been out of it." "You are a slave of the second generation and are still confined to the quarries. I do not understand it. In all Minunian cities, I have been told, slaves of the second generation are given the white tunic and comparative freedom above ground. It was not for me. My mother would not permit it. She would rather I had died than mated with a Veltopis Macusian or another slave, as I must do if I go into the city above." "But how do you avoid it? Your masters certainly do not leave such things to the discretion of their slaves. Where there are so many, one or two may go unaccounted for indefinitely, and women, if they be ill-favored, cause no comment upon the part of our masters. My birth was never reported, and so they have no record of me. My mother took a number for me from the tunic of one who died. And in this way I attract no attention upon the few occasions that our masters or the warriors enter our chamber." "But you are not ill-favored. Your face would surely attract attention anywhere," Tarzan reminded her. For just an instant she turned her back upon him, putting her hands to her face and to her hair, and then she faced him again, and the ape-man saw before him a hideous and wrinkled hag upon whose crooked features no man would look a second time. "God!" ejaculated Tarzan. Slowly the girl's face relaxed, assuming its normal lines of beauty, and with quick, deft touches she arranged her disheveled hair. An expression that was almost a smile haunted her lips. "My mother taught me this," she said, "so that when they came and looked upon me they would not want me." "But would it not be better to be mated with one of them and live a life of comfort above ground than to eke out a terrible existence below ground?" he demanded. "The warriors of Veltapismachus are, doubtless, but little different from those of your own country." She shook her head. "It cannot be for me," she said. "My father is of far Mandalamachus. My mother was stolen from him but a couple of moons before I was born in this horrid chamber, far from the air and sunlight that my mother never tired of telling me about." "And your mother?" asked Tarzan. "Is she here?" The girl shook her head sadly. "They came for her over 20 moons since and took her away. I do not know what became of her." "And these others, they never betray you?" he inquired. "Never. Whatever slave betrayed another would be torn to pieces by his fellows. But come, you must be hungry," and she offered him of the flesh she had been cooking. Tarzan would have preferred his meat raw, but he did not wish to offend her, and so he thanked her and ate that which she offered him, squatting on his haunches across the brazier from her. "It is strange that Alpanato does not come," she remarked, using the Manunian form of 800 cubed plus 19. "Never before has he been so late." A brawny slave, who had approached from behind her, had halted and was looking scowlingly at Tarzan. "Perhaps this is," he said Tarzan to the girl, indicating the man with a gesture. Talaska turned quickly, an almost happy light in her eyes, but when she saw who it was that stood behind her, she rose quickly and stepped back, her expression altered to one of disgust. "No," she said, "it is not he." "You are cooking for him?" demanded the fellow, pointing at Tarzan. "But you would not cook for me," he accused, not waiting for a reply to his question, the answer to which was all too obvious. "Who is he that you should cook for him? Is he better than I? You will cook for me, also." "There are plenty to cook for you," Karaftap replied to Lascar, "and I do not wish to. Go to some other woman. Until there are too many men, we are permitted to choose those whom we shall cook for. I do not choose to cook for you." "If you know what is well for you, you will cook for me," growled the man. "You will be my mate too. I have a right to you because I have asked you many times before these others came. Rather than let them have you, I will tell the Vental tomorrow the truth about you and he will take you away. Have you ever seen Calfastaban?" The girl shuddered. "I will see that Calfastaban gets you," continued Karaftap. "They will not permit you to remain here when they find that you refuse to produce more slaves." "I should prefer Calfastaban to you," sneered the girl, "but neither one nor the other shall have me." "Do not be too sure of that," he cried, and stepping forward, quickly seized her by the arm before she could elude him. Dragging her toward him, the man attempted to kiss her, but he did not succeed. Steel fingers closed upon his shoulder. He was torn roughly from his prey and hurled ruthlessly a dozen paces, stumbling and falling to the floor. Between him and the girl stood the gray-eyed stranger with the shock of black hair. Almost roaring in his rage, Karaftap scrambled to his feet and charged. Tarzan charged as a mad bull charges, with lowered head and bloodshot eyes. "For this you shall die," he screamed. Chapter 12. The son of the first woman strode proudly through the forest. He carried a spear jauntily, and there was a bow and arrows slung to his back. Behind him came 10 other males of his species, similarly armed, and each walked as though he owned the earth he trod. Toward them along the trail, though still beyond their sight, or hearing or smell, came a woman of their kind. She, too, walked with fearless step. Presently her eyes narrowed and she paused, up pricking her great, flat ears to listen, sniffing the air. Men, she increased her gait to a trot, bearing down upon them. There was more than one, there were several. If she came upon them suddenly they would be startled, filled with confusion, and no doubt she could seize one of them before they took to flight. If not, the feathered pebbles at her girdle would seek one out. For some time men had been scarce. Many women of her tribe who had gone out into the forest to capture mates had never returned. She had seen the corpses of several of these herself lying in the forest. She had wondered what had killed them. But here were men at last, the first she had discovered in 2 moons, and this time she would not return empty-handed to her cave. At a sudden turning of the forest trail she came within sight of them, but saw, to her dismay, that they were still a long way off. They would be sure to escape if they saw her, and she was upon the point of hiding when she realized that already it was too late. One of them was pointing at her. Loosing a missile from her girdle and grasping her cudgel more firmly, she started toward them at a rapid, lumbering run. She was both surprised and pleased when she saw that they made no attempt to escape. How terrified they must be to stand thus docilely while she approached them. But what was this? They were advancing to meet her, and now she saw the expressions upon their faces. No fear there, only rage and menace. What were the strange things they carried in their hands? One who was running toward her, the nearest, paused and hurled a long-pointed stick at her. It was sharp, and when it grazed her shoulder it brought blood. Another paused and, holding a little stick across a longer stick, the ends of which were bent back with a piece of gut, suddenly released the smaller stick, which leapt through the air and pierced the flesh beneath one of her arms. And behind these two the others were rushing upon her with similar weapons. She recalled the corpses of women she had seen in the forest and the dearth of men for the past several moons. And though she was dull of wit, yet she was not without reasoning faculties, and so she compared these facts with the occurrences of the past few seconds, with a resultant judgment that sent her lumbering away in the direction from which she had come, as fast as her hairy legs could carry her. Nor did she once pause in her mad flight until she sank exhausted at the mouth of her own cave. The men did not pursue her. As yet they had not reached that stage in their emancipation that was to give them sufficient courage and confidence in themselves to entirely overcome their hereditary fear of women. To chase one away was sufficient. To pursue her would have been tempting Providence. When the other women of the tribe saw their fellow stagger to her cave and sensed that her condition was the result of terror and the physical strain of long flight, they seized their cudgels and ran forth, prepared to meet and vanquish her pursuer, which they immediately assumed to be a lion. But no lion appeared, and then some of them wandered to the side of the woman who lay panting on her threshold. "From what did you run?" they asked her in their simple sign language. "Men," she replied. Disgust showed plainly upon every face, and one of them kicked her and another spat upon her. "There were many," she told them, "and they would have killed me with flying sticks. Look," and she showed them the spear wound, and the arrow still embedded in the flesh beneath her arm. "They did not run from me, but came forward to attack me. Thus have all the women been killed whose corpses we have seen in the forest during the past few moons." This troubled them. They ceased to annoy the prostrate woman. Their leader, the fiercest of them, paced to and fro, making hideous faces. Suddenly she halted. "Come," she signaled. "We shall go forth together and find these men and bring them back and punish them." She shook her cudgel above her head and grimaced horribly. The others danced about her, imitating her expression and her actions, and when she started off toward the forest they trooped behind her, a savage, bloodthirsty company, all but the woman who still lay panting where she had fallen. She had had enough of man. She was through with him forever. "For this you shall die," screamed Karaftap, as he rushed upon Tarzan of the apes in the long gallery of the slaves' quarters in the quarry of Elkamal-Hago, king of Veltapis-Macus. The ape-man stepped quickly aside, avoiding the other, and tripped him with a foot, sending him sprawling, face downward, upon the floor. Karaftap, before he arose, looked about as though in search of a weapon, and his eyes alighting upon the hot brazier, he reached forth to seize it. A murmur of disapproval rose from the slaves who, having been occupied nearby, had seen the inception of the quarrel. "No weapons," cried one. "It is not permitted among us. Fight with your bare hands or not at all." But Karaftap was too drunk with hate and jealousy to hear them or to heed, and so he grasped the brazier and, rising, rushed at Tarzan to hurl it in his face. Now it was another who tripped him, and this time two slaves leapt upon him and wrenched the brazier from his hand. "Fight fair," they admonished him, and dragged him to his feet. Tarzan had stood smiling and indifferent, for the rage of others amused him where it was greater than circumstances warranted, and now he waited for Karaftap, and when his adversary saw the smile upon his face it but increased his spleen, so that he fairly leaped upon the ape-man in his madness to destroy him, and Tarzan met him with the most surprising defense that Karaftap, who for long had been a bully among the slaves, ever had encountered. It was a doubled fist at the end of a straight arm, and it caught Karaftap upon the point of his chin, stretching him upon his back. The slaves, who had by this time gathered in considerable numbers to watch the quarrel, voiced their approval in the shrill "ee-ah-ee-ah" that constituted one form of applause. Dazed and groggy, Karaftap staggered to his feet once more and, with lowered head, looked about him as though in search of his enemy. The girl, Talaskar, had come to Tarzan's side and was standing there looking up into his face. "You are very strong," she said, but the expression in her eyes said more. or at least it seemed to Karaftap to say more. It seemed to speak of love, whereas it was only the admiration that a normal woman always feels for strength exercised in a worthy cause. Karaftap made a noise in his throat that sounded much like the squeal of an angry pig, and once again he rushed upon the ape-man. Behind them some slaves were being let into the corridor, and as the aperture was open, one of the warriors beyond it, who chanced to be stooping down at the time, could see within. He saw but little, though what he saw was enough: a large slave with a shock of black hair raising another large slave high above his head and dashing him to the hard floor. The warrior, pushing the slaves aside, scrambled through into the corridor and ran forward toward the center. Before they were aware of his presence, he stood facing Tarzan and Talaskar. It was Kalfastoban. "What is the meaning of this?" he cried in a loud voice, and then, "Aha! I see. It is the giant. He would show the other slaves how strong he is, would he?" He glanced at Karaftap, struggling to rise from the floor, and his face grew very dark. Karaftap was a favorite of his. "Such things are not permitted here, fellow," he cried, shaking his fist in the ape-man's face and forgetting in his anger that the new slave neither spoke nor understood. But presently he recollected and motioned Tarzan to follow him. "100 lashes will explain to him that he must not quarrel," he said aloud to no one in particular, but he was looking at Talaskar. "Do not punish him," cried the girl, still forgetful of herself. It was all Karaftap's fault, so but acted in self-defense. Kalfastoban could not take his eyes from the girl's face, and presently she sensed her danger and flushed, but still she stood her ground, interceding for the ape-man. A crooked smile twisted Kalfastoban's mouth as he laid a familiar hand upon her shoulder. "How old are you?" he asked. She told him, shuddering. "I shall see your master and purchase you," he announced. "Take no mate." Tarzan was looking at Talaskar, and it seemed that he could see her wilt, as a flower wilts in noxious air, and then Kalfastoban turned upon him. "You cannot understand me, you stupid beast," he said, "but I can tell you, and those around you may listen and perhaps guide you from danger. This time I shall let you off, but let it happen again and you shall have 100 lashes or worse, maybe, and if I hear that you have had aught to do with this girl, whom I intend to purchase and take to the surface, it will go still harder with you." With which he strode to the entrance and passed through into the corridor beyond. After the Vental had departed and the door of the chamber being closed, a hand was laid upon Tarzan's shoulder from behind, and a man's voice called him by name, Tarzan. It sounded strange in his ears, far down in this buried chamber beneath the ground, in an alien city, and among an alien people, not one of whom ever had heard his name. But as he turned to face the man who had greeted him, a look of recognition and a smile of pleasure overspread his features. Kami started to ejaculate, but the other placed a finger to his lips. "Not here," he said. "Here I am, Apanato. But your stature, you are as large as I, it is beyond me. What has happened to swell the race of Minunians to such relatively gigantic proportions?" Comma de Florenzel smiled. "Human egotism would not permit you to attribute this change to an opposite cause from that to which you have ascribed it," he said. Tarzan knit his brows and gazed long and thoughtfully at his royal friend. An expression that was of mingled incredulity and amusement crept gradually over his countenance. "You mean," he asked slowly, "that I have been reduced in size to the stature of a Minunian?" Comma de Florenzel nodded. "Is it not easier to believe that than to think that an entire race of people and all their belongings, even their dwellings and the stones that they were built of, and all their weapons and their diadetes had been increased in size to your own stature?" "But I tell you it is impossible," cried the ape-man. "I should have said the same thing a few moons ago," replied the prince. "Even when I heard the rumor here that they had reduced you, I did not believe it, not for a long time, and I was still a bit skeptical until I entered this chamber and saw you with my own eyes." "How was it accomplished?" demanded Tarzan. "The greatest mind in Veltopusmachus, and perhaps in all Minuni, is Zoanthrogo," explained Comma de Florenzel. "We have recognized this for many moons, for during the occasional intervals that we are at peace with Veltopusmachus, there is some exchange of ideas as well as goods between the two cities, and thus we heard of the many marvels attributed to this greatest of Walmacs." "I have never heard a wizard spoken of in Minuni until now," said Tarzan, for he thought that that was the meaning of the word Walmac, and perhaps it is, as nearly as it can be translated into English. A scientist who works miracles would be, perhaps, a truer definition. "It was Zoanthrohagog who captured you," continued Apanato, "encompassing your fall by means at once scientific and miraculous. After you had fallen, he caused you to lose consciousness, and while you were in that condition you were dragged hither by a score of dyadetes hitched to a hastily improvised litter built of small trees tied securely one to the other. After their branches had been removed, it was after they had you safely within Veltopus that Zoanthrogo set to work upon you to reduce your stature, using apparatus that he has built himself. I have heard them discussing it, and they say that it did not take him long. I hope that Zoanthrogo has the power to undo that which he has done, said the ape-man. They say that that is doubtful. He has never been able to make a creature larger than it formerly was, though in his numerous experiments he has reduced the size of many of the lower animals. The fact of the matter is, continued Alpanato, that he has been searching for a means to enlarge the Veltopus Macusians so that they may overcome all the other peoples of Menuni, but he has only succeeded in developing a method that gives precisely opposite results from that which they seek. So, if he cannot make others larger, I doubt if he can make you any larger than you now are. I would be rather helpless among the enemies of my own world, said Tarzan ruefully. You need not worry about that, my friend, said the prince gently. Why? Asked the ape-man. Because you have very little chance of reaching your own world again, said Como de Florencil, a trifle sadly. I have no hope of ever seeing Trohanadolmachus again. Only by the utter overthrow of Veltopusmachus by my father's warriors could I hope for rescue, since nothing less could overcome the guard in the quarry mouth, while we often capture slaves of the white tunic from the enemy's cities. It is seldom that we gather in any of the green tunic. Only in the rare cases of utter surprise attacks by daylight do any of us catch an enemy's green slaves above ground, and surprise day attacks may occur once in the lifetime of a man, or never. You believe that we will spend the rest of our lives in this underground hole? Demanded Tarzan. Unless we chance to be used for labor above ground during the daytime, occasionally replied the Prince of Trohanadolmachus with a wry smile. The ape-man shrugged. We shall see, he said. After Calfastaban had left, Karaftap had limped away to the far end of the chamber, muttering to himself, his ugly face black and scowling. I am afraid that he will make you trouble, Talaska said to Tarzan, indicating the disgruntled slave with a nod of her shapely head, and I am sorry, for it is all my fault. Your fault? Demanded Como de Florencil. Yes, said the girl. Karaftap was threatening me when Apuntando interfered and punished him. Apuntando? Queried Como de Florencil. That is my number, explained Tarzan. And it was on account of Talaska that you were fighting. I thank you, my friend. I am sorry that I was not here to protect her. Talaska cooks for me. She is a good girl. Como de Florencil was looking at the girl as he spoke, and Tarzan saw how her eyes lowered beneath his gaze and the delicate flush that mounted her cheeks, and he realized that he was downwind from an idea, and smiled. So this is the Aponato of whom you told me, he said to Talaska. Yes, this is he. I am sorry that he was captured, but it is good to find a friend here, said the ape-man. We three should be able to hit upon some plan of escape, but they shook their heads, smiling sadly. For a while after they had eaten, they sat talking together, being joined occasionally by other slaves. For Tarzan had many friends here now since he had chastised Karaftap, and they would have talked all night had not the ape-man questioned Como de Florencil as to the sleeping arrangements of the slaves. Como de Florencil laughed, and pointed here and there about the chamber at recumbent figures lying upon the hard earthen floor, men, women, and children sleeping, for the most part, where they had eaten their evening meal. The green slaves are not pampered, he remarked laconically. I can sleep anywhere, said Tarzan, but more easily when it is dark. I shall wait until the lights are extinguished. You will wait forever, then Como de Florencil told him. The lights are never extinguished, demanded the ape-man. Were they, we should all be soon dead, replied the prince. These flames serve two purposes. They dissipate the darkness and consume the foul gases that would otherwise quickly asphyxiate us. Unlike the ordinary flame that consumes oxygen, these candles, perfected from the discoveries and inventions of an ancient Munian scientist, consume the deadly gases and liberate oxygen. It is because of this, even more than for the light they give, that they are used exclusively throughout Menuni. Even our domes would be dark, ill-smelling, noxious places were it not for them, while the quarries would be absolutely unworkable. Then I shall not wait for them to be extinguished, said Tarzan, stretching himself at full length upon the dirt floor, with a nod and a tuano, a Menunian good night. to Talascar and Commodore Florencil. Chapter 13. As Talascar was preparing their breakfast the following morning, Commodore Florencil remarked to Tarzan that he wished they two could be employed upon the same work, that they might be always together. "If there is ever the chance for escape that you seem to think will someday present itself," he said, "then it will be well if we are together." "When we go," replied Tarzan, "we must take Talascar with us." Commodore Florencil shot a swift glance at the ape-man but made no comment upon his suggestion. "You would take me with you," exclaimed Talascar. "Ah, if such a dream could but be realized. I would go with you to Trojana and be your slave, for I know that you would not harm me, but alas, it can be nothing more than a pleasant daydream, enduring for a brief time. For Calfustoban has spoken for me, and doubtless my master will be glad to sell me to him, for I have heard it said among the slaves that he sells many of his each year to raise the money to pay his taxes." "We will do what we can," Talascar said. Tarzan, "and if Alpanato and I find a means of escape, we will take you with us, but first he and I must find a way to be together more." "I have a plan," said Commodore Florencil, "that might prove successful. They believe that you neither speak nor understand our language. To work a slave with whom they cannot communicate is, to say the least, annoying. I shall tell them that I can communicate with you, when it is quite probable that they will assign us to the same crew." "But how will you communicate with me without using the Manunian language?" demanded the ape-man. "Leave that to me," replied Commodore Florencil. "Until they discover in some other way that you speak Manunian, I can continue to deceive them." It was not long before the fruits of Commodore Florencil's plan ripened. The guards had come for the slaves, and the various parties had gone forth from the sleeping chamber, joining in the corridors without the thousands of others wending their way to the scene of their daily labor. The ape-man joined the timbering crew at the extension of the 13th tunnel at the 36th level, where he once more attacked the monotonous work of shoring the sides and roof of the shaft with an enthusiasm that elicited commendation from even the surly Calfustoban, though Karaftap, who was removing rocks just ahead of Tarzan, often shot venomous looks at the ape-man. The work had been progressing for perhaps 2 or 3 hours when 2 warriors descended the tunnel and halted beside Calfustoban. They were escorting a green-tunicked slave, to whom Tarzan paid no more attention than he did to the warriors until a scrap of the conversation between the warriors and Calfustoban reached his ears. Then he shot a quick glance in the direction of the 4 and saw that the slave was Commodore Florencil, Prince of Trojana, known in the quarries of Veltopis as slave Apanato, or 8319, which is written in Manunian hieroglyphics, glyph 1. Tarzan's number, Apuntando 8321, appeared thus upon the shoulder of his green tunic, glyph 2. Although the Manunian form occupies less space than would our English equivalent of Tarzan's number, which is 512,021, it would be more difficult to read if expressed in English words, for it then would be 10 times 10 times 8 cubed plus 7 times, but the Manunians translate it in no such way. To them, it is a whole number apuntando, which represents at first glance a single quantity, as surely as do the digits 37 represent to our minds an invariable amount, a certain definite measure of quantity, which we never think of as 3 times 10 plus 7, which, in reality, it is. The Manunian system of numerals, while unthinkably cumbersome and awkward from the European point of view, is, however, not without its merits. As Tarzan looked up, Commodore Florencil caught his eye and winked, and then Calfustoban beckoned to the ape-man, who crossed the corridor and stood in silence before the ventile. "Let us hear you talk to him," cried Calfustoban to Commodore Florencil. "I don't believe that he will understand you. How could he, when he cannot understand us? The fellow could not conceive of another language than his own." "I will ask him in his own language," said Commodore Florencil, "if he understands me, and you will see that he nods his head affirmatively." "Very good," cried Calfustoban, "ask him." Commodore Florencil turned toward Tarzan and voiced a dozen syllables of incomprehensible gibberish, and when he was done the ape-man nodded his head. "You see," demanded Commodore Florencil. Calfustoban scratched his head. "It is even as he says," he admitted ruefully, "the Zertalakalal has a language." Tarzan did not smile, though he should have liked to, at the clever manner in which Commodore Florencil had deceived the Veltopis Macusians into believing that he had communicated with Tarzan in a strange language. As long as he could contrive to put all his communications into questions that could be answered by yes or no, the deception would be easily maintained, but under circumstances that made this impossible, some embarrassments might be expected to arise. and he wondered how the resourceful Trohanadal-Makusian would handle these. "Tell him," said one of the warriors to Como de Florenzel, "that his master Zoanthrogo has sent for him, and ask him if he fully understands that he is a slave and that upon his good behavior depends his comfort, yes, even his life, for Zoanthrogo has the power of life and death over him, as much so as have the royal family. If he comes docilely to his master and is obedient, he will not fare ill, but if he be lazy, impudent, or threatening, he may expect to taste the point of a freeman's sword." Como de Florenzel strung out, this time, a much longer series of senseless syllables, until he could scarce compose his features to comport with the seriousness of his mien. "Tell them," said Tarzan, in English, which of course not one of them understood, "that at the first opportunity I shall break the neck of my master, that it would require but little incentive to cause me to seize one of these timbers and crack the skull of Calfustoban and the rest of the warriors about us. And I shall run away at the first opportunity and take you and Talaskar with me." Como de Florenzel listened intently until Tarzan had ceased speaking, and then turned to the two warriors who had come with him to find the ape-man. "Zoanthrol says that he fully understands his position and that he is glad to serve the noble and illustrious Zoanthrogo, from whom he claims but a single boon," translated the Trohanadal-Makusian prince rather freely. "And what boon is that?" demanded one of the warriors. "That I be permitted to accompany him, that he may thus better fulfill the wishes of his master, since without me he could not even know what was desired of him," explained Aponato. Tarzan understood now how Como de Florenzel would surmount whatever difficulties of communication might arise, and he felt that he would be safe in the hands of his quick-witted friend for as long a time as he cared to pretend ignorance of the Menunian tongue. "The thought was even in our minds, slave, when we heard that you could communicate with this fellow," said the warrior to whom Como de Florenzel had addressed the suggestion. "You shall both be taken to Zoanthrogo, who will doubtless decide his wishes without consulting you or any other slave. Come, Calfustoban Vental, we assume responsibility for the slave Zoanthrol," and they handed the Vental a slip of paper upon which they had marked some curious hieroglyphics. Then, with swords drawn, they motioned Como de Florenzel and Tarzan to precede them along the corridor, for the story of Tarzan's handling of Karaftap had reached even to the guardroom of the quarry, and these warriors were taking no chances. The way led through a straight corridor and up a winding spiral runway to the surface, where Tarzan greeted the sunlight and the fresh air almost with a sob of gratitude, for to be shut away from them for even a brief day was to the ape-man cruel punishment, indeed. Here he saw again the vast, endless multitude of slaves bearing their heavy burdens to and fro, the trim warriors who paced haughtily upon either flank of the long lines of toiling serfs, the richly trapped nobles of the higher castes, and the innumerable white-tunic slaves who darted hither and thither upon the errands of their masters, or upon their own business or pleasure, for many of these had a certain freedom and independence that gave them almost the standing of freedom. Always were these slaves of the white tunic owned by a master, but, especially in the case of skilled artisans, about the only allegiance they owed to this master was to pay to him a certain percentage of their incomes. They constituted the bourgeoisie of Menuni, and also the higher caste serving class. Unlike the green tunic slaves, no guard was placed over them to prevent their escape, since there was no danger that they would attempt to escape, there being no city in Menuni where their estate would be improved, for any other city than that of their birth would treat them as alien prisoners, reducing them immediately to the green tunic and lifelong hard labor. The domes of Veltopusmachus were as imposing as those of Trohanadal-Machus. In fact, to Tarzan they appeared infinitely larger, since he now was 1/4 the size he had been when he had left Trohanadal-Machus. There were 8 of them fully occupied and another in course of construction, for the surface population of Veltopusmachus was already 480,000 souls, and as overcrowding was not permitted in the king's dome, the remaining 7 were packed densely with humanity. It was to the royal dome that Tarzan and Como de Florenzel were conducted, but they did not enter by way of the king's corridor, before the gates of which fluttered the white and gold of the royal standards. Instead, they were escorted to the warriors' corridor, which opens toward the west. Unlike the city of Trohanadal-Machus, Veltopusmachus was beautiful in the areas between the domes with flowers and shrubbery and trees, among which wound gravelled walks and broad roadways. The royal dome faced upon a large parade where a body of mounted warriors was at drill. There were 1,000 of them forming an amak, consisting of 4 novans of 250 men each, the larger body being commanded by a kamak, and the smaller by a novand. 5 enteks of 50 men each compose a novand, there being 5 entals of 10 men each to an entex, these latter units commanded by a ventil and a ventex, respectively. The evolutions of the amak were performed with kaleidoscopic rapidity, so quick upon their feet and so well trained were the tiny diadets. There was one evolution in particular performed while he was passing that greatly interested the ape-man. 2 novans formed line at one end of the parade and 2 at the other, and at the command of the kamak, the 1,000 men charged swiftly down the field in 2 solid ranks that approached one another with the speed of an express train. Just when it seemed impossible that a serious accident could be averted, when it seemed that in another instant diadets and riders must crash together in a bloody jumble of broken bones, the warriors rushing so swiftly toward the east raised their agile mounts, which fairly flew above the heads of the opposing force, and alighting upon the other side in an unbroken line continued to the far end of the field. Tarzan was commenting on this maneuver and upon the beauties of the landscaping of the city of Veltopismachus to Como de Florencil as they proceeded along the warriors' corridor, sufficiently ahead of their escort that Tarzan might speak in a low tone without the guard being cognizant of the fact that he was using the language of Menuni. "It is a beautiful evolution," replied Como de Florencil, "and it was performed with a precision seldom attained. I have heard that El Comol Hago's troops are famous for the perfection of their drill, and as justly so as is Veltopismachus for the beauty of her walks and gardens, but my friend, these very things constitute the weakness of the city. While El Como Alga's warriors are practicing to perfect their appearance upon parade, the warriors of my father Adendrohakis are far afield, out of sight of admiring women and spying slaves, practicing the art of war under the rough conditions of the field and camp. The amaks of El Como Hago might easily defeat those of Adendrohakis in a contest for the most beautiful. But it was not long since you saw less than 15,000 Trohanadalmacusians repulse fully 30,000 warriors of Veltopismachus, for they never passed the infantry line that day. Yes, they can drill beautifully upon parade and they are courageous. All Menunians are that. But they have not been trained in the sterner arts of war. It is not the way of El Como Hago. He is soft and effeminate. He cares not for war. He listens to the advice he likes best, the advice of the weaklings and the women who urge him to refrain from war entirely, which would be not altogether bad if he could persuade the other fellow to refrain also. The beautiful trees and shrubs that almost make a forest of Veltopismachus and which you so admire, I too admire them, especially do I admire them in the city of an enemy. How easy it would be for a Trohanadalmacusian army to creep through the night, hidden by the beautiful trees and shrubs, to the very gateways of the domes of Veltopismachus. Do you understand now, my friend, why you saw less perfect maneuvers upon the parade grounds of my city than you have seen here, and why, though we love trees and shrubbery, we have none planted within the city of Trohanadalmachus?" One of the guards who had approached him quickly from the rear touched Como de Florencil upon the shoulder. "You said that Zuanthrol does not understand our language. Why then do you speak to him in this tongue which he cannot understand?" the fellow demanded. Como de Florencil did not know how much the warrior had overheard. If he had heard Tarzan speak in Menuni, it might be difficult to persuade the fellow that the giant did not understand the language, but he must act on the assumption that he, alone, had been overheard. "He wishes to learn it, and I am trying to teach him," replied Como de Florencil quickly. "Has he learned anything of it?" asked the warrior. "No," said Como de Florencil, "he is very stupid." And after this they went in silence, winding up long, gentle inclines, or again scaling the primitive ladders that the Menunians used to reach the upper levels of their dome houses between the occasional levels that are not connected by the inclined runways, which are thus frequently broken for purposes of defense, the ladders being easily withdrawn upward behind hard-pressed defenders and the advance of the enemy thus more easily checked. The royal dome of El Como Hago was of vast proportions, its summit rising to an equivalent of over 400 feet, had it been built upon a scale corresponding to the relatively larger size of ordinary mankind. Tarzan ascended until he was almost as far above ground as he had been below ground in the quarry, where the corridors on lower levels had been crowded with humanity. Those which they now traversed were almost devoid of life. Occasionally they passed a tenanted chamber, but far more generally the rooms were utilized for storage purposes, especially for food, great quantities of which, cured, dried and neatly wrapped, was packed ceiling high in many large chambers. The decorations of the walls were less ornate and the corridors narrower on the whole than those at lower levels. However, they passed through many large chambers or halls which were gorgeously decorated, and in several of which were many people of both sexes and all ages variously occupied, either with domestic activities or with the handiwork of one art or another. Here was a man working in silver, perhaps fashioning a bracelet of delicate filigree or another carving beautiful arabesques upon leather. There were makers of pottery, weavers of cloth, metal stampers, painters, makers of candles, and these appeared to predominate, for the candle was in truth life to these people. And then, at last, they reached the highest level, far above the ground, where the rooms were much closer to daylight because of the diminished thickness of the walls near the summit of the dome, but even here were the ever-present candles. Suddenly the walls of the corridor became gorgeously decorated, the number of candles increased, and Tarzan sensed that they were approaching the quarters of a rich or powerful noble. They halted now before a doorway where stood a sentinel, with whom one of the warriors conducting them communicated. "Tell Zoanthrogo Zertol that we have brought Zoanthrol and another slave who can communicate with him in a strange tongue." The sentinel struck a heavy gong with his lance, and presently, from the interior of the chamber, a man appeared to whom the sentinel repeated the warrior's message. "Let them enter," said the newcomer, who was a white-tunicked slave. "My glorious master, Zoanthrogo Zertol, expects his slave Zoanthrol. Follow me." They followed him through several chambers until at last he led them into the presence of a gorgeously garbed warrior who was seated behind a large table, or desk, upon which were numerous strange instruments, large, cumbersome-looking volumes, pads of heavy Manunian writing paper, and the necessary implements for writing. The man looked up as they entered the room. "It is your slave, Zoanthrol Zertol," announced the fellow who had led them hither. But the other Prince Anthrogo pointed at Commodore Florencil. "He speaks the strange language that Zoanthrol speaks, and he was brought along that you might communicate with Zoanthrol if you so wished." Zoanthrogo nodded. He turned to Commodore Florencil. "Ask him," he ordered, "if he feels any differently since I reduced his size." When the question was put to Tarzan by Commodore Florencil in the imaginary language with which they were supposed to communicate, the ape-man shook his head, at the same time speaking a few words in English. "He says no, illustrious prince," translated Commodore Florencil out of his imagination, "and he asks when you will restore him to his normal size and permit him to return to his own country, which is far from Manuni." "As a Manunian he should know," replied the Zertol, "that he never will be permitted to return to his own country. Trohanadalmachus never will see him again." "But he is not of Trohanadalmachus, nor is he a Manunian," explained Commodore Florencil. "He came to us and we did not make a slave of him, but treated him as a friend, because he is from a far country with which we have never made war." "What country is that?" demanded Zoanthrohago. "That we do not know, but he says that there is a great country beyond the thorns where dwell many millions as large as was he. He says that his people would not be unfriendly to ours, and for this reason we should not enslave him, but treat him as a guest." Zoanthrogo smiled. "If you believe this, you must be a simple fellow, Trohanadalmacusian," he said. "We all know that there is naught beyond Manuni but impenetrable forests of thorn to the very uttermost wall of the blue dome within which we all dwell. I can well believe that the fellow is no Trohanadalmacusian, but he most certainly is a Manunian, since all creatures of whatever kind dwell in Manuni. Doubtless he is a strange form of Zertalakalal, a member of a tribe inhabiting some remote mountain fastness which we have never previously discovered, but be that as it may, he will never." At this juncture the prince was interrupted by the clanging of the great gong at the outer entrance to his apartments. He paused to count the strokes, and when they reached 5 and ceased, he turned to the warriors who had conducted Tarzan and Commodore Florencil to his presence. "Take the slaves into that chamber," he instructed, pointing to a doorway in the rear of the apartment in which he had received them. "When the king has gone, I will send for them." As they were crossing toward the doorway, Zoanthrogo had indicated a warrior halted in the main entrance to the chamber. "Elkomo Hago," he announced, "Thagosta of Veltipusmachus, ruler of all men, master of created things, all wise, all courageous, all glorious, down before the Thagosta." Tarzan glanced back as he was quitting the chamber to see Zoanthrogo and the others in the room kneel, and lean far back with arms raised high above their heads as Elkomo Hago entered with a guard of a dozen gorgeous warriors. And he could not but compare this ruler with the simple and dignified soldier who ruled Trohanadalmachus and who went about his city without show or pomp, and oftentimes with no other escort than a single slave, a ruler to whom no man bent his knee, yet to whom was accorded the maximum of veneration and respect. And Elkomo Hago had seen the slaves and the warriors leave the chamber as he had entered it. He acknowledged the salutes of Zoanthrohago and his people with a curt wave of the hand, and commanded them to arise. "Who quitted the apartment as I entered?" he demanded, looking suspiciously at Zoanthrogo. "The slave Zoanthrol and another who interprets his strange language for me," explained the Zatul. "Have them back," commanded the Tagasto. "I would speak with you concerning Zoanthrol." Zoanthrogo instructed one of his slaves to fetch them, and in the few moments that it required, Elcomoelgo took a chair behind the desk at which his host had been sitting. When Tarzan and Como de Florencil entered the chamber, the guard who accompanied them brought them to within a few paces of the desk behind which the king sat, and here he bade them kneel and make their obeisance to the Tagasto. Familiar since childhood was every tradition of slavery to Como de Florencil, the Trojana Dalmacusian, but almost in a spirit of fatalism had he accepted the conditions of this servitude that the fortunes of war had thrust him into, and so it was that, without question or hesitation, he dropped to one knee in servile salute to this alien king, but not so Tarzan of the Apes. He was thinking of Adendrohakis. He had bent no knee to him, and he did not propose to do greater honor to Elcomoelhago, whose very courtiers and slaves despised him, than he had done to the really great king of Veltapismachus. Elcomoelhago glared at him. "The fellow is not kneeling," he whispered to Zoanthrogo, who had been leaning back so far that he had not noticed the new slave's act of disrespect. The Zertol glanced toward Tarzan. "Down, fellow," he cried, and then recalling that he understood no Manunian, he commanded Como de Florencil to order him to kneel, but when the Trojana Dalmacusian Zatolosto pretended to do so, Tarzan but shook his head. Elcomoelhago signaled the others to rise. "We will let it pass this time," he said, for something in the attitude of the slave told him that Zoanthrol never would kneel to him, and as he was valuable because of the experiment of which he was the subject, the king preferred to swallow his pride rather than risk having the slave killed in an effort to compel him to kneel. "He is but an ignorant Zetalakalo. See that he is properly instructed before we see him again." Chapter 14. The Alali women, 50 strong, sallied forth into the forest to chastise their recalcitrant males. They carried their heavy bludgeons and many feathered pebbles, but most formidable of all was their terrific rage. Never in the memory of one of them had man dared question their authority, never had he presumed to show aught but fear of them, but now, instead of slinking away at their approach, he had dared defy them, to attack them, to slay them. But such a condition was too preposterous, too unnatural to exist, nor would it exist much longer. Had they had speech, they would have said that and a number of other things. It was looking black for the men. The women were in an ugly mood, but what else could be expected of women who were denied the power of speech? And in this temper they came upon the men in a large clearing where the renegades had built a fire and were cooking the flesh of a number of antelope. Never had the women seen their men so sleek and trim. Always before had they appeared skinny to the verge of cadaverousness, for in the past they had never fared so well as since the day that Tarzan of the Apes had given weapons to the son of the first woman. Where before they had spent their lives fleeing in terror from their terrible women with scarce time to hunt for decent food, now they had leisure and peace of mind, and their weapons brought them flesh that otherwise they might not have tasted once in a year. From caterpillars and grub worms they had graduated to an almost steady diet of antelope meat. But the women gave very little heed at the moment to the physical appearance of the men. They had found them. That was enough. They were creeping nearer when one of the men looked up and discovered them, and so insistent are the demands of habit that he forgot his newfound independence, and leaping to his feet, bolted for the trees. The others, scarce waiting to know the cause of his precipitancy, followed close upon his heels. The women raced across the clearing as the men disappeared among the trees upon the opposite side. The former knew what the men would do. Once in the forest they would stop behind the nearest trees and look back to see if their pursuers were coming in their direction. It was this silly habit of the males that permitted their being easily caught by the less agile females. But all the men had not disappeared. One had taken a few steps in the mad race for safety and had then halted and wheeled about, facing the oncoming women. He was the son of the first woman, and to him Tarzan had imparted something more than knowledge of new weapons, for from the Lord of the Jungle, whom he worshipped with dog-like devotion, he had acquired the first rudiments of courage. And so it now happened that when his more timorous fellows paused behind the trees and looked back, they saw this one standing alone facing the charge of 50 infuriated shes. They saw him fit arrow to bow, and the women saw too, but they did not understand, not immediately, and then the bowstring twanged and the foremost woman collapsed with an arrow in her heart, but the others did not pause. Because the thing had been done so quickly that the full purport of it had not as yet penetrated their thick skulls. The son of the first woman fitted a second arrow and sped it. Another woman fell, rolling over and over, and now the others hesitated, and were lost, for that momentary pause gave courage to the other men peering from behind the trees. If one of their number could face 50 women and bring them to halt, what might not 11 men accomplish? They rushed forth then with spears and arrows just as the women renewed their assault. The feathered pebbles flew thick and fast, but faster and more accurately flew the feathered arrows of the men. The leading women rushed courageously forward to close quarters where they might use their bludgeons and lay hold of the men with their mighty hands, but they learned then that spears were more formidable weapons than bludgeons, with the result that those who did not fall wounded turned and fled. It was then that the son of the first woman revealed possession of a spark of generalship that decided the issue for that day, and perhaps for all time. His action was epochal in the existence of the Zertalakalols. Instead of being satisfied with repulsing the women, instead of resting upon laurels gloriously won, he turned the tables upon the hereditary foe and charged the women, signaling his fellows to accompany him, and when they saw the women running from them, so enthused were they by this reversal of a custom ages old, they leaped swiftly in pursuit. They thought that the son of the first woman intended that they should slay all of the enemy, and so they were surprised when they saw him overhaul a comely young female and, seizing her by the hair, disarm her. So remarkable did it seem to them that one of their number, having a woman in his power, did not immediately slay her. They were constrained to pause and gather around him, asking questions in their strange sign language. "Why do you hold her? Why do you not kill her? Are you not afraid that she will kill you?" were some of the many that were launched at him. "I am going to keep her," replied the son of the first woman. "I do not like to cook. She shall cook for me. If she refuses, I shall stick her with this," and he made a jab toward the young woman's ribs with his spear, a gesture that caused her to cower and drop fearfully upon one knee. The men jumped up and down in excitement as the value of this plan and the evident terror of the woman for the man sank into their dull souls. "Where are the women?" they signed to one another, but the women had disappeared. One of the men started off in the direction they had gone. "I go," he signaled, "I come back with a woman of my own to cook for me." In a mad rush the others followed him, leaving the son of the first woman alone with his she. He turned upon her. "You will cook for me?" he demanded. To his signs she but returned a sullen, snarling visage. The son of the first woman raised his spear, and with the heavy shaft struck the girl upon the head, knocking her down, and he stood over her, himself snarling and scowling, menacing her with further punishment, while she cowered where she had fallen. He kicked her in the side. "Get up," he commanded. Slowly she crawled to her knees and, embracing his legs, gazed up into his face with an expression of dog-like adulation and devotion. "You will cook for me?" he demanded again. "Forever," she replied in the sign language of their people. Tarzan had remained but a short time in the little room adjoining that in which Zoanthrogo had received Elcomoel Hago, when he was summoned to appear before them alone, and as he entered the room his master motioned him to approach the desk behind which the two men sat. There was no other person in the room, even the warriors having been dismissed. "You are quite positive that he understands nothing of our language?" demanded the king. "He has not spoken a word since he was captured," replied Zoanthrogo. "We had supposed him some new form of Zertalakolol until it was discovered that he possessed a language through which he was able to communicate with the other Trahanadal Makushin slave. It is perfectly safe to speak freely before him, all-wise." Elkomo Hago cast a quick, suspicious glance at his companion. He would have preferred that Zoanthrogo of all men address him as all-glorious. It was less definite in its implication. He might deceive others, even himself, as to his wisdom, but he was perfectly aware that he could not fool Zoanthrogo. "We have never discussed fully," said the king, "the details of this experiment. It was for this purpose that I came to the laboratory today. Now that we have the subject here, let us go into the matter fully and determine what next step we should take." "Yes, all-wise," replied Zoanthrogo. "Komi Thagosoto," snapped Elkomoa Hago. "Yes, Thagosoto," said the prince, using the Manunian word for chief royal or king, as Elkomoa Hago had commanded. "Let us discuss the matter by all means. It presents possibilities of great importance to your throne." He knew that what Elkomoa Hago meant by discussing the matter consisted only in receiving from Zoanthrogo a detailed explanation of how he had reduced the stature of the slave Zoanthrol to 1/4 its original proportions, but he proposed, if possible, to obtain value received for the information, which he knew the king would use for his own aggrandizement, giving Zoanthropogo credit whatever for his discoveries or all the long moons he had devoted to accomplishing this marvelous scientific miracle. Before we enter into this discussion, O Thagasoto, he said, I beg that you will grant me one boon which I have long desired and have hitherto hesitated to request, knowing that I did not deserve the recognition I crave for my poor talents and my mean service to thy illustrious and justly renowned rule. What boon do you wish? Demanded Elcomowahago crustily. At heart he feared this wisest of men, and like the coward that he was, with him to fear was to hate. If he could have destroyed Zoanthrogo, he would gladly have done so, but he could not afford to do this, since from this greatest of Walmacs came whatever show of scientific ability the king could make, as well as all the many notable inventions for the safeguarding of the royal person. I would sit at the royal council, said Zoanthrogo simply. The king fidgeted. Of all the nobles of Veltapismachus, here was the very last he would wish to see numbered among the royal councillors, whom he had chosen with a special reference to the obtuseness of their minds. There are no vacancies, he said at last. The ruler of all men might easily make a vacancy, suggested Zoanthrogo, or create a new post-assistant chief of chiefs, for example, so that when Gofoloso was absent there would be one to take his place. Otherwise I should not have to attend upon your council meetings, but devote my time to the perfection of our discoveries and inventions. Here was a way out, and Elcomowahago seized it. He had no objection to Zoanthropogo being a royal councillor and thus escaping the burdensome income tax, which the makers of the tax had been careful to see proved no burden to themselves, and he knew that probably that was the only reason that Zoanthropogo wished to be a councillor. No, the king had no objection to the appointment, provided it could be arranged that the new minister was present at no council meetings, for even Elcomowahago would have shrunk a bit from claiming as his own all the great discoveries of Zoanthropogo, had Zoanthropogo been present. Very well, said the king, you shall be appointed this very day, and when I want you at the council meetings I will send for you. Zoanthropogo bowed. And now he said, to the discussion of our experiments, which we hope will reveal a method for increasing the stature of our warriors when they go forth to battle with our enemies, and of reducing them to normal size once more when they return. I hate the mention of battles, cried the king with a shudder. But we must be prepared to win them when they are forced upon us, suggested Zoanthropogo. I suppose so, assented the king, but once we perfect this method of ours we shall need but a few warriors, and the rest may be turned to peaceful and useful occupations. However, go on with the discussion. Zoanthropogo concealed a smile, and rising walked around the end of the table and stopped beside the ape-man. Here, he said, placing a finger at the base of Tarzan's skull, there lies, as you know, a small, oval, reddish-grey body containing a liquid which influences the growth of tissues and organs. It long ago occurred to me that interference with the normal functioning of this gland would alter the growth of the subject to which it belonged. I experimented with small rodents and achieved remarkable results, but the thing I wished to accomplish, the increase of man's stature, I have been unable to achieve. I have tried many methods, and someday I shall discover the right one. I think I am on the right track, and that it is merely now a matter of experimentation. You know that stroking your face lightly with a smooth bit of stone produces a pleasurable sensation. Apply the same stone to the same face in the same manner, but with greatly increased force, and you produce a diametrically opposite sensation. Rub the stone slowly across the face and back again many times, and then repeat the same motion rapidly for the same number of times, and you will discover the results are quite different. I am that close to a solution. I have the correct method, but not quite as yet the correct application. I can reduce creatures in size, but I cannot enlarge them, and although I can reduce them with great ease, I cannot determine the period or endurance of their reduction. In some cases, subjects have not regained their normal size under 39 moons, and in others they have done so in as short a period as 3 moons. There have been cases where normal stature was regained gradually during a period of 7 suns, and others where the subject passed suddenly from a reduced size to normal size in less than 100 heartbeats. This latter phenomenon being always accompanied by fainting and unconsciousness when it occurred during waking hours. Of course, commented Elcomowahago. Now, let us see. I believe the thing is simpler than you imagine. You say that to reduce the size of this subject you struck him with a rock upon the base of the skull, therefore to enlarge his size. The most natural and scientific thing to do would be to strike him a similar blow upon the forehead, Fetch the rock, and we will prove the correctness of my theory." For a moment Zoanthrogo was at a loss as to how best to circumvent the stupid intention of the king without humiliating his pride and arousing his resentment. But the courtiers of Elcumulhago were accustomed to think quickly in similar emergencies, and Zoanthrogo speedily found an avenue of escape from his dilemma. "Your sagacity is the pride of your people, Thagasoto," he said, "and your brilliant hyperbole the despair of your courtiers. In a clever figure of speech you suggest the way to achievement. By reversing the manner in which we reduced the stature of Zoanthrol, we should be able to increase it, but alas, I have tried this and failed. But wait. Let us repeat the experiment precisely as it was originally carried out, and then, by reversing it, we shall perhaps be enabled to determine why I have failed in the past." He stepped quickly across the room to one of a series of large cupboards that lined the wall, and opening the door of it revealed a cage in which were a number of rodents. Selecting one of these, he returned to the table, where with wooden pegs and bits of cord he fastened the rodent securely to a smooth board, its legs spread out and its body flattened, the underside of the lower jaw resting firmly upon a small metal plate set flush with the surface of the board. He then brought forth a small wooden box and a large metal disc, the latter mounted vertically between supports that permitted it to be revolved rapidly by means of a hand crank. Mounted rigidly upon the same axis as the revolving disc was another which remained stationary. The latter disc appeared to have been constructed of 7 segments, each of a different material from all the others, and from each of these segments a pad, or brush, protruded sufficiently to press lightly against the revolving disc. To the reverse side of each of the 7 segments of the stationary disc a wire was attached, and these wires Zoanthrogo were now connected to 7 posts projecting from the upper surface of the wooden box. A single wire attached to a post upon the side of the box had at its other extremity a small, curved metal plate attached to the inside of a leather collar. This collar Zoanthrogo adjusted about the neck of the rodent so that the metal plate came in contact with its skin at the base of the skull and as close to the hypophysis gland as possible. He then turned his attention once more to the wooden box, upon the top of which, in addition to the 7 binding posts, was a circular instrument consisting of a dial, about the periphery of which were a series of hieroglyphics. From the center of this dial projected 7 tubular, concentric shafts, each of which supported a needle, which was shaped or painted in some distinguishing manner. While beneath the dial 7 small metal discs were set in the cover of the box, so that they lay in the arc of a circle, from the center of which a revolving metal shaft was so arranged that its free end might be moved to any one of the 7 metal discs at the will of the operator. The connections having all been made, Zoanthrogo moved the free end of the shaft from one of the metal discs to another, keeping his eyes at all times intently upon the dial, the 7 needles of which moved variously as he shifted the shaft from point to point. Elcumulhago was an intent, if somewhat bewildered observer, and the slave Zoanthrol, unobserved, had moved nearer the table that he might better watch this experiment which might mean so much to him. Zoanthrogo continued to manipulate the revolving shaft, and the needles moved hither and thither from one series of hieroglyphics to another, until at last the Wolmak appeared satisfied. "It is not always easy," he said, "to attune the instrument to the frequency of the organ upon which we are working. From all matter, and even from such incorporeal a thing as thought, there emanate identical particles, so infinitesimal as to be scarce noted by the most delicate of my instruments. These particles constitute the basic structure of all things, whether animate or inanimate, corporeal or incorporeal. The frequency, quantity, and rhythm of the emanations determine the nature of the substance. Having located upon this dial the coefficient of the gland under discussion, it now becomes necessary, in order to so interfere with its proper functioning that the growth of the creature involved will be not only stopped but actually reversed, that we decrease the frequency, increase the quantity, and compound the rhythm of these emanations. This I shall now proceed to do." And he forthwith manipulated several small buttons upon one side of the box, and grasping the crank handle of the free disc, revolved it rapidly. The result was instantaneous and startling. Before their eyes, Elcumulhago, the king, and Zoanthrol, the slave, saw the rodent shrink rapidly in size while retaining its proportions unchanged. Tarzan, who had followed every move and every word of the Wolmak, leaned far over that he might impress indelibly upon his memory the position of the 7 needles. Elcumulhago glanced up and discovered his interest. "We do not need this fellow now," he said, addressing Zoanthrogo. "Have him sent away." "Yes, Thagasoto," replied Zoanthrogo, Summoning a warrior whom he directed to remove Tarzan and Comma de Florencil to a chamber where they could be secured until their presence was again required. Chapter 15. Through several chambers and corridors they were conducted toward the center of the dome on the same level as the chamber in which they had left the king and the Walmack, until finally they were thrust into a small chamber and a heavy door slammed and barred behind them. There was no candle in the chamber. A faint light, however, relieved the darkness so that the interior of the room was discernible. The chamber contained 2 benches and a table, that was all. The light, which faintly illuminated it, entered through a narrow embrasure which was heavily barred, but it was evidently daylight. "We are alone," whispered Comma de Florencil, "and at last we can converse, but we must be cautious," he added. "Trust not too far the loyalty of even the stones of your chamber," he quoted. "Where are we?" asked Tarzan. "You are more familiar with Manunian dwellings than I." "We are upon the highest level of the royal dome of El Como El Hago," replied the prince. "With no such informality does a king visit the other domes of his city. You may rest assured that this is El Como El Hago's. We are in one of the innermost chambers. Next, the central shaft that pierces the dome from its lowest level to its roof. For this reason we do not need a candle to support life. We will obtain sufficient air through this embrasure. And now, tell me what happened within the room with El Como El Hago and Zoanthrago." "I discovered how they reduced my stature," replied Tarzan, "and furthermore, that at almost any time I may regain my full size, an occurrence that may eventuate from 3 to 39 moons after the date of my reduction. Even Zoanthrago cannot determine when this thing will happen. Let us hope that it does not occur while you are in this small chamber," exclaimed Comma de Florencil. "I would have a devil of a time getting out," agreed Tarzan. "You would never get out," his friend assured him. "While you might, before your reduction, have crawled through some of the larger corridors upon the first level, or even upon many of the lower levels, you could not squeeze into the smaller corridors of the upper levels, which are reduced in size as the necessity for direct supports for the roof increase as we approach the apex of the dome." "Then it behooves me to get out of here as quickly as possible," said Tarzan. Comma de Florencil shook his head. "Hope is a beautiful thing, my friend," he said, "but if you were a Manunian you would know that under such circumstances as we find ourselves it is a waste of mental energy. Look at these bars." And he walked to the window and shook the heavy irons that spanned the embrasure. "Think you that you could negotiate these?" "I haven't examined them," replied the ape-man, "but I shall never give up hope of escaping. That your people do is doubtless the principal reason that they remain forever in bondage. You are too much a fatalist, Comma de Florencil." As he spoke, Tarzan crossed the room and, standing at the prince's side, took hold of the bars at the window. "They do not seem over heavy," he remarked, and at the same time exerted pressure upon them. They bent. Tarzan was interested now in Comma de Florencil as well. The ape-man threw all his strength and weight into the succeeding effort, with the result that 2 bars, bent almost double, were torn from their setting. Comma de Florencil gazed at him in astonishment. "Zoanthrago reduced your size, but left you with your former physical prowess," he cried. "In no other way can it be accounted for," replied Tarzan, who now, one by one, was removing the remaining bars from the window embrasure. He straightened one of the shorter ones and handed it to Comma de Florencil. "This will make a good weapon," he said, "if we are forced to fight for our liberty," and then he straightened another for himself. The Trohandel Macusian gazed at him in wonder. "And you intend," he demanded, "to defy a city of 480,000 people, armed only with a bit of iron rod?" "And my wits," added Tarzan. "You will need them," said the prince. "And I shall use them," Tarzan assured him. "When shall you start?" asked Comma de Florencil, chaffingly. "Tonight, tomorrow, next moon, who knows?" replied the ape-man. "Conditions must be ripe. All the time I shall be watching and planning. In that sense I started to escape the instant I regained consciousness and knew that I was a prisoner." Comma de Florencil shook his head. "You have no faith in me?" demanded Tarzan. "That is precisely what I have, faith," replied Comma de Florencil. "My judgment tells me that you cannot succeed, and yet I shall cast my lot with you, hoping for success, yes, believing in success. If that is not faith, I do not know what it might be called." The ape-man smiled. He seldom, if ever, laughed aloud. "Let us commence," he said. "First, we will arrange these rods so that they will have the appearance from the doorway of not having been disturbed, for I take it we shall have an occasional visitor. Someone will bring us food at least, and whoever comes must suspect nothing." Together they arranged the rods so that they might be quickly removed and as quickly replaced. By that time it was getting quite dark within the chamber. Shortly after they had finished with the rods, their door opened and two warriors, lighting their way with candles, appeared escorting a slave who bore food in bucket-like receptacles and water in bottles made of glazed pottery. As they were going away again, after depositing the food and drink just inside the doorway, taking their candles with them, Como de Florencil addressed them. "We are without candles, warrior," he said to the nearer. "Will you not leave us one of yours?" "You need no candle in this chamber," replied the man. "One night in darkness will do you good, and tomorrow you return to the quarry. Zoanthroco is done with you. In the quarry you will have plenty of candles," and he passed out of the chamber, closing the door behind him. The two slaves heard the heavy bolt shot into place upon the opposite side of the door. It was very dark now. With difficulty they found the receptacles containing the food and water. "Well," inquired Como de Florencil, dipping into one of the food jars, "do you think it is going to be so easy now when tomorrow you will be back in the quarry, perhaps 500 huels below ground?" "But I shall not be," replied Tarzan, "and neither shall you." "Why not?" asked the prince. "Because since they expect to remove us to the quarries tomorrow, it follows that we must escape tonight," explained Tarzan. Como de Florencil only laughed. When Tarzan had eaten his fill, he arose and walked to the window, where he removed the bars and, taking the one that he had selected for himself, crawled through the passage that led to the opposite end of the embrasure, for even so close to the apex of the dome the wall was quite thick. Perhaps 10 huels. The huel, which is about 3 inches in length by our standards, constitutes the Manunian basic unit of measure, corresponding most closely to our foot. At this high level the embrasure was much smaller than those opening at lower levels, practically all of which were of sufficient size to permit a warrior to walk erect within them, but here Tarzan was forced to crawl upon all fours. At the far end he found himself looking out into a black void above which the stars were shining, and about the sides of which were dotted vague reflections of inner lights, marking the lighted chambers within the dome. Above him it was but a short distance to the apex of the dome. Below was a sheer drop of 400 huels. Tarzan, having seen all that could be seen from the mouth of the embrasure, returned to the chamber. "How far is it, Como de Florencil?" he asked, "from the floor of this embrasure to the roof of the dome?" 12 huels, perhaps," replied the Trohanodalmacusian. Tarzan took the longest of the bars from the embrasure and measured it as best he could. "Too far," he said. "What is too far?" demanded Como de Florencil. "The roof," explained Tarzan. "What difference does it make? Where the roof is, you did not expect to escape by way of the roof of the dome, did you?" "Most certainly had it been accessible," replied the ape-man, "but now we shall have to go by way of the shaft, which will mean crossing entirely through the dome from the interior shaft to the outer periphery. The other route would have entailed less danger of detection." Como de Florencil laughed aloud. "You seem to think that to escape a Manunian city it is only necessary to walk out and away. It cannot be done. What of the sentries? What of the outer patrols? You would be discovered before you were halfway down the outside of the dome, provided that you could get that far without falling to your death." "Then perhaps the shaft would be safer," said Tarzan. "There would be less likelihood of discovery before we reach the bottom. From what I could see, it is as dark as pitch in the shaft." "Clamber down the inside of the shaft," exclaimed Como de Florencil. "You are mad. You could not clamber from this level to the next without falling, and it must be a full 400 huels to the bottom." "Wait," Tarzan admonished him. Como de Florencil could hear his companion moving around in the dark chamber. He heard the scraping of metal on stone, and presently he heard a pounding, not loud yet heavy. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Wait," said Tarzan. And Como de Florencil waited, wondering. It was Tarzan who spoke next. "Could you find the chamber in which Talascar is confined in the quarry?" he asked. "Why?" demanded the prince. "We are going after her," explained Tarzan. "We promised that we would not leave without her." "I can find it," said Como de Florencil, rather sullenly, Tarzan thought. For some time the ape-man worked on in silence, except for the muffled pounding and the scraping of iron on stone, or of iron on iron. "Do you know everyone in Trohanodalmacus?" Tarzan asked suddenly. "Why, no," replied Como de Florencil. "There are 1,000,000 souls, including all the slaves. I could not know them all." Did you know by sight all those that dwelt in the royal dome? Continued the ape-man. No, not even those who lived in the royal dome, replied the Trohanadal-Makusian, though doubtless I knew practically all of the nobles, and the warrior class by sight if not by name. Did anyone ask Tarzan? I doubt it was the reply. Good, exclaimed Tarzan. Again there was a silence, broken again by the Englishman. Can a warrior go anywhere without question in any dome of his own city? He inquired. Anywhere, under ordinary circumstances, except into the king's dome, in daytime. One could not go about at night, then asked Tarzan. No, replied his companion. By day, might a warrior go and come in the quarries as he pleased? If he appeared to be employed, he would not be questioned, ordinarily. Tarzan worked a little longer in silence. Come, he said presently, we are ready to go. I shall go with you, said Como de Florenzel, because I like you and because I think it would be better to be dead than a slave. At least we shall have some pleasure out of what remains to us of life, even though it be not a long life. I think we shall have some pleasure, my friend, replied Zoanthrol. We may not escape, but like you, I should rather die now than remain a slave for life. I have chosen tonight for our first step toward freedom, because I realize that once returned to the quarry, our chances for a successful break for liberty will be reduced to almost nothing. And tonight is our only night above ground. How do you propose that we escape from this chamber? By way of the central shaft, replied Tarzan, but first tell me, may a white-tunicked slave enter the quarries freely by day? Como de Florenzel wondered what bearing all these seemingly immaterial questions had upon the problem of their escape, but he answered patiently. No, white tunics are never seen in the quarries. Have you the iron bar I straightened for you? Yes. Then follow me through the embrasure. Bring the other rods that I shall leave in the opening. I will carry the bulk of them. Come. Como de Florenzel heard Tarzan crawling into the embrasure, the iron rods that he carried breaking the silence of the little chamber. Then he followed. In the mouth of the embrasure he found the rods that Tarzan had left for him to carry. There were 4 rods, the ends of each bent into hooks. It had been upon this work that Tarzan had been engaged in the darkness. Como de Florenzel wondered to what purpose. Presently his further advance was halted by Tarzan's body. Just a moment, said the ape-man. I am making a hole in the window ledge. When that is done we shall be ready. A moment later he turned his head back toward his companion. Pass along the rods, he said. After Como de Florenzel had handed the hooked rods to Tarzan, he heard the latter working with them, very quietly, for several minutes. And then he heard him moving his body about in the narrow confines of the embrasure, and presently when the ape-man spoke again, the Trohanadal-Makusian realized that he had turned around and that his head was close to that of his companion. I shall go first, Como de Florenzel, he said. Come to the edge of the embrasure, and when you hear me whistle once, follow me. Where? asked the prince. And down the shaft to the first embrasure that will give us foothold, and let us pray that there is one directly below this within the next 18 hewels. I have hooked the rods together, the upper end hooked into the hole I made in the ledge, the lower end dangling down a distance of 18 hewels. Goodbye, my friend, said Como de Florenzel. Tarzan smiled and slipped over the edge of the embrasure. In one hand he carried the rod that he had retained as a weapon, with the other he clung to the window ledge. Below him for 18 hewels dangled the slender ladder of iron hooks, and below this 400 hewels of pitchy darkness hid the stone flagging of the inner courtyard. Perhaps it roofed the great central throne room of the king, as was true in the royal dome of Edendro-Hakis. Perhaps it was but an open court. The truth was immaterial if the frail support slipped from the shallow hole in the ledge above, or if one of the hooks straightened under the weight of the ape-man. Now he grasped the upper section of his ladder with the hand that held his improvised weapon, removed the hand from the ledge and grasped the rod again, still lower down. In this way he lowered his body a few inches at a time. He moved very slowly for 2 reasons, the more important of which was that he feared that any sudden strains upon his series of hooks might straighten one of them and precipitate him into the abyss below. The other was the necessity for silence. It was very dark even this close to the summit of the dome, but that was rather an advantage than otherwise, for it hid his presence from any chance observer who might glance through one of the embrasures in the opposite wall of the shaft. As he descended, he felt in both directions for an embrasure, but he was almost at the end of his ladder before he felt himself swing slightly into one. When he had lowered himself still farther and could look into the opening, he saw that it was dark, an indication that it did not lead into an inhabited chamber, a fact for which he was thankful. He hoped, too, that the inner end of the embrasure was not barred, nor the door beyond bolted upon the outside. He whistled once, very low for Como de Florençal, and an instant later he felt the movement of the iron ladder that told him his companion had commenced the descent. The embrasure in which he stood was higher than the one they had just quitted, permitting him to stand erect. There he waited for the Trojana Dalmatian, who was soon standing upon the ledge beside him. "Will you?" exclaimed the prince, in a whisper. "I should hate to have had to do that in the daytime when I could have seen all the way to the bottom. What next? We have come farther already than ever I dreamed would be possible. Now, I am commencing to believe that escape may lie within the realm of possibilities." "We haven't started yet," Tarzan assured him, "but we are going to now. Come." Grasping their rude weapons, the two walked stealthily the length of the embrasure. There were no bars to impede their progress, and they stepped to the floor of the chamber beyond. Very carefully feeling each step before he planted a foot, and with his weapon extended before him, Tarzan groped his way about the chamber, which he found was fairly well filled with casks and bottles, the latter in wooden and wicker cases. Como de Florençal was directly behind him. "We are in one of the rooms where the nobles charged with enforcing the laws against wine have hidden confiscated liquor," whispered the Trojana Dalmatian. "I have heard much talk concerning the matter since I was made prisoner. The warriors and the slaves, too, seem to talk of nothing else but this and the high taxes. The chances are that the door is heavily barred. They guard these forbidden beverages as never they guarded their gold or jewels." "I have found the passageway leading to the door," whispered Tarzan, "and I can see a light beneath it." They crept stealthily the length of the passage. Each grasped his weapon more firmly as Tarzan gently tried the latch. It gave. Slowly the ape-man pushed the door ajar. Through the tiny aperture thus opened, he could see a portion of the room. Its floor was strewn with gorgeous carpets, thick and soft. That portion of the wall that was revealed to him was hung with heavy fabrics woven in many colors and strange patterns, splendid, barbaric. Directly in the line of his vision, the body of a man lay sprawled, face down. Upon the floor, a pool of red stained a white rug beneath his head. Tarzan opened the door a little farther, revealing the bodies of 3 other men. 2 lay upon the floor, the third upon a low divan. The scene, gorgeous in its coloring, tragic in its suggestion of mystery and violent death, held the eyes of the ape-man yet a moment longer before he opened the door still wider and leaped quickly to the center of the room, his weapon raised and ready, giving no possible skulking foe behind the door the opportunity to fell him that would have offered had he edged into the room slowly. A quick glance about the apartment showed the bodies of 6 men that had not been visible from the partially opened door. These were lying in a pile in one corner of the room.